Welcome to the preliminary prototype for Side 2 music program, hosted by yours truly, Ethan Morris. And what I'm going to do today to kind of start off, I thought it would be a good category, is to, first of all, show you just kind of what's going on with my record collection. So, part of my record collection is upstairs in another room. Just got this house in August, so we have a lot more room. I'm getting the record room set up down here. I've got most of my collection upstairs, most of my CD collection down here, and my friend Laura's record collection is down here, which you can see. And if I pan around, you can see CDs, records stacked up 4 miles, and it's a good place to be, so I'm not complaining. So what we're going to do on this show is we're going to do a lot of lists. I'm going to list favorite guitar players, favorite bassists, favorite songs, favorite albums by an artist, focus on specific genres, different things like that. So hope you enjoy the show. And the first topic I thought we would pick to start off with is my favorite albums currently and kind of all time. So what I narrowed it down to is my top 20, and then I couldn't do that, so I had to even throw in one more and make it 21. Couldn't get it down to an even 20, but I also have some honorable mentions as well. These are kind of albums that have kind of stuck with me over time. Some of my favorite music. I tried to keep it in the rock genre. Didn't stray too much over into things that other styles of music that I like country. I do have one kind of country-esque album by a rock band in here, but honorable mentions that could have been included but aren't because they're not really rock are like Beastie Boys' "Check Your Head." It's one of my all-time favorite albums. Johnny Cash, "A Folsom Prison," obviously. Blues records by like Little Walter and Freddie King, people like that. So I'm not going to include the other genres, and I'm also trying to stray away from too many solo artists, although there are some in here. This is mostly rock bands, so I narrowed it down to my top 20. Some of these albums I have on CD, some of these albums I have on vinyl records, some of them I have on both formats. So here we go, and I'll try to, they're not in any particular order, so I'm going to try to save the 3 or 4 of my absolute favorite albums for the end. So the first record is the debut album by Boston, and one of the most perfect albums ever recorded. 1976, definitely falls under the arena rock genre. This band, huge album, first of all, multi-million dollar for up until Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses was the highest selling debut album by a rock band. I don't remember how many millions it sold, but tens of millions, I'm pretty sure. A lot of hits on this, obviously. More Than a Feeling, Long Time, Foreplay going into Long Time, Peace of Mind, Hitch a Ride is my all-time favorite song by them. It's on this. More of a radio song, not so much a top 40 single. Just an amazing album because most of the guitar tracks, as we all know now, are recorded by Tom Scholz, the lead guitarist, in his basement. He worked for the Kodak company. I think he worked for IBM for a while, just kind of a tech wizard, and recorded most of the actual tapes, the master tapes for this album, in his home studio, which is pretty phenomenal when you think about it. You typically think of home recordings, being a little more basic sounding, punk rock and stuff like that. And this fell under the guise of arena rock. So huge album, big sound, great band, great lead vocals by Brad Delp, the late great Brad Delp. And for a long time, they would only have, Their second album, Don't Look Back, in 1978, and then their third album wouldn't be released until 1986, which is Third Stage. Um, but just really catchy poppy songs, but in a hard rock vein. I think for a long time, Boston sort of got the tag of being cheesy arena rock. Shortly after this album was released, the punk movement started, and on through the 80s, a lot of people kind of gave them a lot of crap for being, this slick, big, one of these kind of quasi-prog with the album cover, album art. But I think in time, people have really come back to appreciate them for their musicianship. And I don't know, I think it's just all the way around. Many, many artists have referenced this album and this band, from alternative bands to hard rock bands. So they've got their credit. So that's the first one on my list. Before I go on with the rest of the list, I want to do some honorable mentions. I actually couldn't find it in my collection because my collection's all over the place. But Roxy Music's first album, 1972, one of the only albums with Brian Eno still on it. Just a very weird album, very unusual. Still weird to this day, Brian Ferry on lead vocals, very good musicianship, very original in their image and their sound. I think they sometimes got overlooked in the United States as just being like another glam band from Britain, and their influence is immeasurable. Bands from U2, a lot of the synth pop bands of the 80s were influenced by them greatly. Another honorable mention is Pleasure Principle by Gary Newman. Just a very weird album. 1979 actually includes his biggest hit in the States, Cars, which was a top 10 hit for some reason. One of the weirdest songs to go to the top 10 here. And played the Moog synthesizer with a full band, with an actual bass player, drummer, which I think is a really cool sound. So that's an honorable mention of mine. Another honorable mention is Pyromania, the third album by Def Leppard from 1983. A lot of metal purists look to their first two albums as being when they were truly heavy metal. And a lot of people have said, with this album they went pop and they just weren't metal anymore. And it enraged a lot of metal fans at the time. However, I think this has some really heavy stuff on it, actually. Songs like Foolin', Rock Rock Till You Drop, Stage Fright. Those are all songs that are pretty, Action Not Words. Those are pretty heavy songs. Not to mention the real catchy hit singles like Photograph, which definitely was taking them in a pop vein, and Rock of Ages, which is heavy song still. But this was the first album with Phil Collen, who replaced Pete Willis, who I think a lot of metal purists really like the Willis and Steve Clark combination, the twin guitar attack. But Phil Collen came in. He was from a band called Girl from London, and he had experience playing and touring, and he's just an amazing lead guitar player, and I think he complemented Steve Clark really well. So I kind of disagree. I think Pyromania was their last real solid metal album. It still had some metal elements. I think Hysteria, their next album in '87, of course, their mega hit, even bigger than this one, which was a huge album, was when they really went pop. But I like Hysteria too, so for different reasons. I don't think of it as a heavy metal album. I think of it as a pop, hard rock album. But anyway, honorable mentions there. All right, so the next one on my list is The Doors' first album. And I actually own this album on CD as well. Goes without saying, one of the most influential, biggest rock bands of all time. Certainly one of the biggest American rock bands. Definitely innovative. I don't think they get actually enough credit for that. They've influenced a lot of the British bands that came later in the 70s and 80s, plus all the alternative bands in the 90s and thereafter all look to The Doors. This first album is pretty much a perfect album. Obviously you have Break On Through, you have The End, you have Light My Fire, their biggie. Crystal Ship is my favorite Doors song. 20th Century Fox. You got, and then some bluesy stuff like Backdoor Man. Um, Side two has got some like hidden gems actually. End of the Night's a great song, and of course The End, which is one of their big live um, songs they'd like to do live, and was pretty unusual in 1967. But they were one of the many cool bands that were on the Elektra label in the mid to late 60s, um, along with Arthur Lee and Love and a lot of others. But the Stooges, MC5, bands like that. But anyway, first album. The only track I kind of don't like, I think it's the weakest one, is the Alabama song "Whiskey Bar," which is actually a cover, so makes sense. So definitely has to be on my list. And like I said, some of these are going to be on CD, some of them are going to be on record. Next album on my list, I am straying away from the rock genre a little bit just in this one album, but I had to do it because I think this album is so influential on the country rock and folk rock movement that would happen in the 70s shortly after The Sweetheart of the Rodeo by the Byrds. This was 1968, a total departure for them, as far as most fans in the rock world knew. I mean, this was the band that were kind of like America's answer to the Beatles. They were doing this kind of rock stuff, psychedelic, bordering on psychedelic with 8 Miles High and stuff like that. But then they took a total country turn with this album, and it features an uncredited Graham Parsons, who would later become a legend, in his own right, with the Flying Burrito Brothers and solo career. But this includes Hickory Wind, one of his compositions, of course. Everybody knows the story of him and Keith Richards hanging out with the Rolling Stones and his supposed influence on some of their early 70s work. It's rumor. No one knows for sure who wrote what. But anyway, this is the Byrds' attempt at country music, and I think they pulled it off really well. I've heard discussions where people are like, is it real country? And some of the country world really rejected this album in the 60s. It was a much more conservative time in the country music, in Nashville especially. But this holds up, and this belongs in any rock collection. Every song is great. The irony here, though, is Roger McGuinn and Chris Hillman had played folk and country and bluegrass music before they were in the Byrds, in the early 60s. So it's kind of fitting that they would do this. Plus, they got Graham, who is from the South and knew country music, and put this together. But some really good stuff on here. I Am a Pilgrim, Bob Dylan's You Ain't Going Nowhere, The Christian Life, which is a Louvin Brothers song. I think they really showed with this album that a rock band can do a serious country album, or any other genre for that matter. And it was one of the first times a serious rock band had said, we're going to do this and show the rock audience another genre of music so that they can appreciate it. And it really did change people's minds about country music, which was important. Okay, so next one up. I don't actually have, this is a weird one, so I don't have the actual album in my collection. I do and I don't, okay? So the album is Black Sabbath's Volume 4, which I think is their greatest album, but this is weird. I found this in a CD shop years ago, and it says Children of the Grave on it, but if you look at the tracks, all the tracks are, all the songs from Volume 4. Volume 4, by far my favorite Black Sabbath album. I think that the first album, it gets a close nod. I mean, it's very close. A lot of success with the second album, Paranoid, which is not my favorite. I think there's some moments on it, but there's also some moments that are not so great. It's hit or miss. Every song on this is great. Wheels of Confusion just slays. Tomorrow's Dream. Then they go all Pretty on Us with the piano ballad Changes, which is probably the prettiest song Black Sabbath ever did. Supernaut, which is my favorite Black Sabbath song. Snowblind, Cornucopia, Under the Sun. Cornucopia and Under the Sun are probably some of the creepiest Black Sabbath albums or songs. Um, and I just think that the riffs that Tony Iommi was doing at the time were amazing. I mean, some of the things he's doing on these songs, he's all over the place, and it's very heavy. This is a very heavy album. This was kind of taking them in the direction they were going to go in with the next albums, which were Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and Sabotage. Just really, really heavy riffing and really tight as a band. I think they got a lot better. So that's 1972 when that one came out. A lot of great albums came out that year. That was one of those years. It's kind of like The Doors in 67. 67 is when Sgt. Pepper came out. And The Doors, Jimi Hendrix, a lot of those things. 72 was another year. And another of my favorite albums also came out that year. Huge, legendary album. Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. David Bowie. This was kind of his breakthrough. Hunky Dory had come out before in 71, was kind of hinting at the sound that would come, but it was another one. It was one of those patchy albums, had like 2 or 3 good tracks on it. When this is one of those albums where every song is good. I mean, there's not really a bad song on it. Moon Age Daydream, Starman, It Ain't Easy, Lady Stardust, Hang On to Yourself, of course the title track, Ziggy Stardust, and Suffragette City. Just solid and very influential on a lot of artists. Can't say enough about that. I mean, I think it goes without saying, but it's still a phenomenal album. It's still in my top 20. Next album up, so a few years before, Grateful Dead. This is one I have on CD as well. This is sort of a beat up copy, but this is American Beauty. One of 2 albums they released in 1970. The other one being Working Man's Dead. And it's not just the fact that songwriting had improved quite a bit for them, but the band had really gotten tighter. They started to gel more. And the sound that they were using here, Phil Lesh's bass playing is a lot more in the front. I think they were getting away from some of the kind of like experimental psychedelia stuff, and they were kind of focusing more on country and bluegrass and this sort of kind of down-home sound in a way. Working Man's Dead ranks up there very close to my top 20, but this album doesn't really have a bad song on it. I mean, classics like Box of Rain, Ripple, Broke Down Palace, Till the Morning Comes, one of my favorite songs. Addicts on My Life, beautiful. Friend of the Devil, Sugar Magnolia, and Candyman. Candyman is probably my favorite Grateful Dead song. Truckin' is also on this, which was their biggest hit until Touch of Grey years later in the 80s. Not one of my favorite songs, Truckin', but every other song, superb on this one. And I've always kind of been a Grateful Dead fan. I grew up on them, and they were not somebody that I would put in my top 20 for years, just because I was listening to so many other things and discovering new music. But as I've gotten older, I realize what an amazing band they actually are. And I know that sounds silly to some of you who are big fans already, but as far as putting them into my top 20, I had to mature a little bit. Next one up, this is another one I have on CD and on vinyl. I'm going to show you the vinyl. This Cheap Trick's live album at Budokan. I picked up this copy at a flea market for like $5 years ago, and I've had it, 20 years. 1978? 79 it was released? Yeah, 79. It's a lot of songs from In Color, and the song Surrender is on that, which is from Heaven Tonight, which was, I think, the album before this. This was my introduction to Cheap Trick. These are the songs that get played on the radio. I Want You to Want Me and Ain't That a Shame. But the deeper cuts on this, like Look Out, Come On, um, and Hello There really show the band for what they were live, which is the true nature of the band. An amazing band that were hugely influential, but I don't think they get their credit. I think they're kind of underrated. Rick Nielsen is a master songcraft guy, songwriter, and the band was just really tight. Bunny Carlos on drums. I love the way Tom Peterson plays the distorted bass. It kind of adds like a third guitar here, but they mix really well. And Robin Zander's vocals are just perfect for that sound. It's kind of this Beatlesque um, Big Star meets The Move, kind of melded into this Midwestern band, very American. Anyway, one of my all-time favorite bands. Got to see them in Atlanta at the Music Midtown, like 1996. Um, Definitely one of my all-time favorites. Now, this one could be a little bit controversial because they're really known for their debut album. And I actually think their best stuff, their best era, their debut came out in 87. Um, their best era was 85 to 86 before they got signed. And some of that material is included on this. This is Guns N' Roses, their 1988 EP, GNR Lies. It was kind of put out quickly because of the popularity of the band. They needed to get some more material out to ride the wave of Guns N' Roses mania that was happening in the late 80s. And the acoustic stuff is great. Patience, obviously, is one of their best songs, recorded in 88. Used to Love Her, You're Crazy, One in a Million. But for me, it's the live stuff, the stuff recorded in 86, which was a self-released Live Like a Suicide EP, which has their version of Nice Boys by Tattoo Rose. Also Reckless Life. They also do a cover of Mama Kin by Aerosmith. That's the stuff. That's when the band, that's, if you go online now, you can find, and I think it's even been packaged and released, some of their live stuff from the club days, like playing the Marquee in London. That's when they were really at their best. By the time the debut album came out, they were really kind of already not disintegrating, but when the popularity of that album happened, they really went downhill after about 89. And a lot of people would say, why wouldn't you include that in your top 20? I just think there's a couple of tracks on that I don't think are as strong as I think the hits are the strongest thing on Appetite for Destruction, but it's an amazing album, of course, and at the time was very a breath of fresh air, needed at that time. But GNR Lies is the one I always go back to. I can listen to it anytime. Next on my list, I think I also have this on vinyl as well. Neil Young's Harvest, also from 1972. Great year. My favorite Neil Young songs are on this: Old Man and Needle and the Damage Done. This is a very dark album in a lot of ways. He was dealing with the death of a friend from a heroin overdose. It's got some strange songwriting on it. Heart of Gold was a big hit off this. A Man Needs a Maid. The title track's amazing. He was definitely in a dark place. His writing and kind of where he was mentally. But there's not too many things that Neil Young has put out that are bad. But this is, of course, ranks up there really high. This is one I can listen to pretty much all the time. Definitely leaning more towards the country movement that was going on at the time in the early 70s. But yeah, definitely one of my favorites. Next up is a band I grew up listening to, The Police, Ghost in the Machine. It was kind of a toss-up for me. I came really close to picking Zenyatta Mandata, but I think there's a couple of tracks on Zenyatta Mandata. I think some of my favorite Police songs are on Zenyatta Mandata, which was the album before this in 1980. But there's some other filler tracks that are just a little bit weaker. This is a pretty much perfect album. Side 1 is where all the hits are, like Spirit in the Material World, Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic, Invisible Sun. Then when you start moving towards side 2, you get all the the kind of reggae, upbeat stuff. Demolition Man, Too Much Information, One World. And the very end of the album is very interesting because you have Secret Journey and Darkness, which is a strange little kind of a dark take on love. Sting was doing some interesting things with synthesizer and bass and effects. Um, just a really well recorded album, not just the songwriting, but the way it was recorded and the technology used is very impressive. So that's one I can listen to anytime. Next on my list, another album from the 80s, Ride the Lightning by Metallica. Just a solid album all the way through. And I know a lot of people are really like, oh, well, that's a very specific subgenre, thrash metal. But it's a subgenre that they invented, let's be honest. And this is when they really came into their own. Kill 'Em All was the first album in 83, but most of the material on Kill 'Em All was written a year or two before. So that's why it seemed like such a departure when they went from 83 and Kill 'Em All and the songs on this, which was 84. The subject matter is darker. Songs like Fade to Black and Ride the Lightning, which is about capital punishment, Trapped Under Ice, Creeping Death. My favorite song, Fight Fire with Fire, and Ride the Lightning, the title track. And then it also has For Whom the Bell Tolls. I mean, For Whom the Bell Tolls and Fade to Black alone. James Hetfield was in some very dark spaces when he wrote this, but it's a really rocking album. And their musicianship was just solid. The classic lineup, Kirk Hammett, lead guitar. He had completely replaced Dave Mustaine at this point. I think Dave was on a couple songs on Kill 'Em All still. And the late, great Cliff Burton on bass. And of course, Lars on drums and James on lead vocals and rhythm guitar. But solid album. Can't get sick of that one. This is a more recent one I've been into. 1970, Derek and the Dominoes, which was really Eric Clapton, and featured Duane Allman from the Allman Brothers, and a really solid band. This was Eric Clapton trying to reinvent himself. He was tired of the whole Clapton is God thing, and he was really trying to kind of refresh his image, but also his sound. He was trying to get inspired again because he was getting tired of kind of all the big superstardom and everything. Just a really good album. It's got Bonnie and Delaney on it, which he took a lot from their sound and had this really American sound with this album. It's also got Duane Allman on it, and he would kind of keep the sound for a while. His debut album, his solo album, Eric Clapton in 1970 also, as well as albums like 461 Ocean Boulevard. Probably my favorite tracks on this are It's Too Late, which was recorded by a lot of people. It's a Chuck Willis song that was done by Buddy Holly and other people. Why Does Love Have Got to Be So Sad? I Looked Away. Of course, the title track's Layla, which I'm not crazy about, but Bell Bottom Blues is one of the other hits, which I do like a lot. And I really just got into that album. I grew up listening to that. My parents had it. I just got into it recently, the last year or so. Really started getting into that album. And right now it's in my top 20. This is one of my all-time favorite bands. And while I love a lot of their studio albums, nothing compares to Humble Pie, Rockin' the Fillmore. 1971, I believe. This is when Peter Frampton was still in the band. And this may be controversial for some people who are fans of Humble Pie, although my favorite studio album by them is also from 1972. It's called Smokin', which was right after this, after Peter had left. But I think this was the best lineup. I think when Peter Frampton was in the band, I think his guitar added something. In the vocal styles, they would all trade off lead vocals. It really complemented Steve Marriott's soulful wail. This really captures, this is one of the greatest live albums of all time. This really captures the soul of the band and how intense they were live. This is one you just have to put on and listen to all the way. This is definitely a hanging out on the back porch, drinking some beers, it's an all-nighter. All right, next up, I should say too that a band that another honorable mention is another one I have to get it out of my collection. Um, is Funhouse by the Stooges, who are also on Elektra Records, along with The Doors and Love and MC5. Definitely one of my all-time favorite albums. It didn't make this top 20 just because I couldn't find my copy, but I know it's here somewhere. But that being said, MC5, Kick Out the Jams, 1968 it was recorded, I believe, Halloween night, and then released in 69. Very unusual, a live album recorded at the Grandy Ballroom, they were the house band in Detroit, Michigan, and affiliated with the Revolutionary White Panther Party, as many of you know. This is just an explosive debut album. Straight to the point, 8 songs. Ramblin' Rose, Kick Out the Jams, the title track, Come Together, Rocket Reducer. The level of energy that they put into this performance is just electrifying. I mean, you just imagine what it would have been like to see this live. But they were a very flashy band, lots of American flags and gold ruffled shirts and things like that. But they were definitely ahead of their time and a little unusual and a little loud, and so they didn't get the success that they deserved. But MC5, definitely one of my favorite groups, have been for a while. Next on my list, Ramones, debut album, 1976. Kind of started it all for the punk movement of the mid-70s. All the bands like Sex Pistols and The Clash from England really looked to this album. This is what kind of kicked it off. Just a classic album. Short songs, 2 minutes. Blitzkrieg Bop, Judy's a Punk, Beat on the Brat, I Want to Be Your Boyfriend, and my favorite Ramones song, Loudmouth, is on this. 53rd and Third is another great one. Another must-have. Even if you're not into punk rock, there's something about this album that kind of, I don't know, it just pulls you in. The songs are so catchy and so loud and so fast. It just kind of gets you going. And speaking of Elektra Records in the 1960s, another one of the bands I previously mentioned, this was a debate between their first album in 1966 and this album. It's Arthur Lee and Love Forever Changes. This was the third album, and while I kind of prefer the first 2 albums' sound, just because they were more garage, straight ahead, kind of punkish sound, this album is a masterpiece. I mean, every song is superb, and it's one of those you have to put on from beginning to end, and it just takes you to all these places. I was lucky enough to get to see the late, great Arthur Lee in about 2003 at the Warsaw Club in Brooklyn, and it was pretty amazing to see him do a lot of these songs from Forever Changes. And I remember Patti Smith and Lenny Kaye were in the audience, which was pretty cool to see. But unfortunately passed away from cancer shortly after that. Big influence on Robert Plant, Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix took a lot of his image from Arthur Lee. It was an unusual situation. Arthur Lee being a black guy playing this rock music, acid rock or whatever they called it at the time, and with a real punkish vibe and a real garage kind of sound with those first 2 albums. Very psychedelic, very frantic. This still has that element of frantic energy and quasi psychedelia, but it's a lot more refined, calmed down. It's quieter. There's a lot of Spanish influences on this. It's another cool thing about this album is he takes a lot of influences from world music, mostly Central American kind of Spanishy stuff. There's a lot of cool instrumentation on this too. That's when you just have to listen to it to understand. And I'm actually going to show this album. This is technically not my favorite album by them anymore, but this is the one that I've known about the longest, and it's their biggie. I'm actually lately been really into their album In Rock from 1971, I believe. But this is Deep Purple's Machine Head from 1972. Classic lineup of Ian Gillan on vocals, screaming vocals, Ian Pace on drums, um, Roger Glover, John Lord on the organ, Roger Glover on bass, and of course the mighty Ritchie Blackmore on guitar. That lineup would kind of solidify their place in rock history for the next couple of albums until Ian Gillan left and was replaced by David Coverdale, later of Whitesnake. But the songs on this are just phenomenal with that distorted organ. Lazy, it's just a masterpiece. The longest song on the album, kind of orchestral. They kind of mix some classical influences in there. Space Truckin', Highway Star, and of course the big hit, Smoke on the Water, is on this. Probably the one that's been, I don't need to hear again, it's kind of played out. But everything else on here is just amazing. Very driving album, and doesn't get enough credit, I don't think, for what it is, and the influence that they wield. And now I'm down to my last four. So I told you I was going to do 21. And a band that's always been one of my all-time favorite bands, probably my top 3 favorite bands, REM. For me, it was Green. A lot of people might say other albums. Green was when I got into REM. I was 13 years old. The lyrics just really spoke to me. The musicianship was weird. It was in the era when hair metal was going on and pop music, and REM had always been kind of referred to as this college rock or modern rock. And then they come out with this, which is a really driving, kind of louder album. The guitar work is amazing by Peter Buck. There's some instrumentation that's unique, lap steel guitar, some cello. They were introducing the mandolin. Peter started playing that. Pop Song 89, Get Up, You Are the Everything, which has the mandolin. Classic. World Leader Pretend, Orange Crush, Turn You Inside Out. It's like their heaviest song on here, if REM can have a heavy song. Just a unique theme, too. The themes, the lyric writing Michael Stipe was doing was really based around the individual and the individual's place in the world with all of the crazy politics and weather phenomenon and everything else that goes on. And this is really kind of what the album's about. You kind of have to dig a little deeper and think a little bit when you listen to this one. But this is the one that got me into them, and I still think it's their best. Next up, debut album by the Black Crowes, Shake Your Moneymaker. Almost a perfect album. I could live without Hard to Handle. Never need to hear that song again, which is a cover, Otis Redding song. Don't Wake Me was a bonus track on this. Stratton Blues I could live without. Everything else is classic. Stare At Cold's my all-time favorite Black Crowes song. The big hits were, of course, Jealous Again, Twice as Hard, and Hard to Handle. But the album cuts, Stare At Cold, Sister Luck, Seeing Things, which is also a single, and Thick and Thin. And of course the other big hit single, She Talks to Angels, on this. Just a superb debut from a bunch of guys who were kind of unheard of. From my hometown, Atlanta, Georgia. And even got some work, some piano work from the former piano player for the Allman Brothers. But just a great first album. They're very young at the time. Chris and Rich Robinson brothers. They were like 24 and 21 years old. 1990. A band that's really always had a special place in my heart, and I once again couldn't find my favorite album by them, which is their self-titled album and third album from 1968 or 69. So I just pulled out the best of for this segment, best of Velvet Underground. And this one's funny because it says words and music of Lou Reed, but it's all Velvet Underground songs. This is kind of a good collection, cross-section of all their albums. When I first heard the Velvet Underground, I had never heard anything like it. I'd always read about them, but at the time, It was before the internet, so you couldn't just hear anything anytime you wanted like you can now. So this was the first CD I got by them, and I was a teenager, I guess, and I just remember hearing the first track, which is "I'm Waiting for the Man," and then when it gets to songs like "What Goes On" and "Beginning to See the Light," which are from my favorite album, the self-titled, it was sort of like hearing the band that I'd always wanted to hear my whole life. Can't explain it any better than that. Not the most technical musicians, definitely influential on the punk and new wave and alternative movements of later years. 67 to 70, or 66 to 70s when they were basically around, and one of the most influential bands of all time. But yeah, not technical musicians, but Lou Reed's songwriting, superb. I mean, he wrote jingles for commercials and stuff before this, and had been in bands. And Brian Eno famously once said, only 5,000 people bought the first Velvet Underground album, but all 5,000 of those people went out and formed a rock band. So, all right, and last but not least, before I show my last record, I just want to say, there's many other bands I could have picked. A lot of people are like, why didn't no Beatles albums, no Rolling Stones. Sticky Fingers was another an honorable mention that I would probably include if it was a different day. But lately, this is kind of based on what I've been listening to lately too. I'm gonna go with Led Zeppelin 2, of course. Been listening to them my whole life. Kind of grew up on it, and then as a teenager, got really serious. I think Houses of the Holy from '73 is their perfect album, but this is the album I always come back to. Just a reworking of a lot of blues standards, and just superb. Every song, just a real driving groove on this. Lemon Song, Bring It On Home, Ramble On might be my favorite song by them. And of course, this has the big hit, A Whole Lot of Love. What Is and What Should Never Be. Huge album for them, and still one that I always go back to. Well, and I hope you enjoyed the preliminary first episode of Side 2 music program, and hopefully you'll like the show, and we'll continue to watch and leave comments and likes at the bottom. Thank you.